start with these showdowns. This has happened before. We're going to get into how it's happened before with other administrations. But it's never been quite this dramatic, never been quite this extreme. And we may, in fact, have a constitutional showdown that'll only be played out in the courts.
Yeah, President Trump said in an interview yesterday that the Mueller report is the final decision. He believes the case is closed and he wants to move on, obviously, and willing to block anyone in his current White House or former employees of the White House from testifying. So hours after anonymous sources told the Post that the Trump administration will fight congressional subpoenas like the one sent to ex-White House counsel Don McGahn, the president himself went on the record telling Robert Costa of the Post that he believes additional testimony is unnecessary. The president saying, quote, "I allowed my lawyers and all the people to go and testify to Mueller, and you know how I feel about that whole group of people that did the Mueller report. I was so transparent. They testified for so many hours. They have all that information that's been given." He went on, "I fully understood that at the beginning I had my choice." President Trump added of his decision to allow his aides to testify in Mueller's probe, "I could have taken the absolute opposite route." The New York Times, meanwhile, reported last year that when Mueller asked to interview McGahn in 2017, to the surprise of the White House counsel's office, President Trump and his lawyers signaled they had no objection, without knowing the extent of what McGahn was going to tell investigators. Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler said last night because the committee's subpoena covers the topics McGahn discussed in the Mueller report, they cannot comply with one investigation and obstruct another, saying, quote, "The moment for the White House to assert some privilege to prevent this testimony from being heard has long since passed." So, Joe, Don McGahn may have a choice here. The president can tell him not to testify. Don McGahn can ignore that request from the president and sit before the Judiciary Committee by answering that subpoena.
He can. We'll see exactly what happens. He certainly doesn't want to be held in contempt of Congress,
right.
and he's already said as much. He also doesn't want to violate any privilege that the White House may have. But, you know, Jim VandeHei, we all remember when the president allowed Don McGahn to testify without much of a fight in front of the Mueller investigation. And actually, on this point, the president actually he has a point, which is, well, you know, we cooperated with the Mueller investigation. He gave, you know, tens of hours of time and interviews before the Mueller team. So why does he need to do it again? You might be able to understand that reasoning. The only problem with that is that because he testified for so long in front of Mueller, that privilege, that executive privilege, by all, I would think for all intents and purposes, that's waived, and any court would determine that it would be waived.
Yeah, it's a big problem for the White House because Don McGahn is sort of the star of the Mueller report, and I think really has the opportunity to be kind of the star of this whole saga dealing with Donald Trump because he knows so much and he testified for so long. And I do think because they waived that executive privilege, no matter how much the president wants to run out the clock and drag this out, eventually most people who've looked at it think that McGahn probably will end up testifying before Congress. And that's problematic because, like, Don McGahn, obviously, you just read the Mueller report. Some of the most captivating sections in that report are about McGahn and about efforts to obstruct justice and obstruct that probe and being instructed himself to tell things that he knew to be lies. And that's a big problem. And the president read that report or read the summary of the report or watched the coverage of the summaries of the report, and he's livid that these people who worked for him testified and embarrassed him. And so he's not just saying, don't you testify, Don McGahn. He's saying anybody inside the White House, anybody affiliated with this. He's saying turn down the subpoenas, protect my tax returns. He wants to drag this thing out, and he doesn't want anyone else sitting before Congress. And he believes, and probably rightly so, that Republicans will stand behind him, both in Congress and voters. And he feels, one of his aides told us last night, he thinks it's actually a good political issue. He'll take it to the courts just like he did his business cases before being in the presidency. And he thinks that he'll be able to drag it out to the election day, and it hurts Democrats to be fighting him on this topic where he feels he won because the Mueller report didn't call for an indictment or say that he obstructed justice specifically.
Yeah, you know, and I think the president's right in this case. I don't think he's going to get much pushback from Republicans in Congress. I don't think he's going to get much pushback from the voters by defying Congress and having a showdown with the Democratic House. This has happened before, John Heilemann, not to the extent that we're seeing right now, but we all remember back in 2011 when the Republican House Oversight Committee was trying to get information on Fast and Furious from then Attorney General Eric Holder, held him in contempt. And from 2011 to 2016, they didn't get any of the answers that they wanted. I've got to say, for one, I'm ready for the courts to bring some sort of resolution to this, because a contempt of Congress does not have the bite that it should have. And we learned that not only in the Obama administration, but in the Bush administration. White Houses, for the most part, have been able to run roughshod over oversight committees. I think it's time for the D.C. Circuit and the Supreme Court to step in and be aggressive and give some of the Article 1 power back.
Yeah, I mean, look, Joe, I think yes, I think we are, if on the current trajectory we're on, we're headed for a court battle, and I obviously have one with extraordinarily high stakes. I think, the politics are a little different, I think, for this president, this Congress over these issues than they were over Fast and Furious or over a variety of other times when executive branches claimed executive privilege in an overbroad way. The history here, the history that people will go to will be to go to Nixon and go to Watergate, and I think I think the interesting question to me is the political one, where if you think about where things were just 5 days ago. Nancy Pelosi was telegraphing to the entire world that she did not want to pursue impeachment. Much of the Democratic caucus was reluctant to pursue impeachment. And so in that sense, Donald Trump's interests and much of the Democratic majority's interests were aligned in the sense that Donald Trump doesn't want to be impeached, and the House Democrats were not eager to try to impeach him. And yet somehow by defying the House in such a blanket way on this issue and on others, and getting into such a pronounced fight with Pelosi over such an important institutional prerogative, it seems to me as though the president's almost inviting impeachment at this point. He's making it increasingly difficult for Democrats not to take that step, a step that, as I said, they weren't really eager to take. But if the president's going to continue and the White House are going to continue to play the game the way they're playing it, with this level of aggression and this level of total disregard for the institutional prerogatives of Congress, I think he's kind of backing Nancy Pelosi in some sense into a corner where she's going to have to go ahead and start down the path in a more straightforward way, down the path towards impeachment. And I think the pressure on Democrats from the Democratic base is just rising as they see the White House acting with this kind of impudence.
Yeah, which, again, that's exactly what Donald Trump would hope would happen. That would be the reaction I think he'd hope to see, because he knows that if impeachment hearings start, his numbers are going to be going up, Willie, and we talked about that yesterday. Another thing that this constitutional showdown brings up, I wouldn't call it a constitutional crisis, which would have happened if Donald Trump had fired Mueller, but this constitutional showdown once again shows that, of all the institutions that have held up well during the challenges brought on by the Trump administration, one that it continues to cause me problems is the Office of the Attorney General, and that was the case before Barr got in there. Because think about this: when a Congress holds an administration in contempt for not testifying or not turning over documents, then to be prosecuted, you have to go where? To a U.S. attorney.
Right.
Who has to get the approval from the Attorney General. One of the reasons why Eric Holder from 2011 to 2016 was able to ignore subpoena after subpoena and contempt citation after contempt citation really does seem to me we need to re-examine the role of the Attorney General and move it beyond being such a partisan position to almost being like the FBI director, where the AG is appointed for 10-year service.
Yeah, well, William Barr obviously showed his hand last week when a lot of people were hoping he would stand in the breach and have a clear and concise explanation and a fair explanation for what was in the Mueller report. He got out ahead of it and put a partisan spin on it. So we know where he stands, and I understand your concerns. And Elise, it's not just this story about blocking testimony from the White House. There's all kinds of stonewalling. We can go back to the tax returns and also a lawsuit that was just filed by President Trump and the Trump Organization against Elijah Cummings, the chair of the Oversight Committee, because he's seeking Trump Organization financial records, the president accusing Elijah Cummings of overstepping his role in oversight. So they are battening down the hatches at the White House and sealing the place off.
Well, and definitely your point about William Barr, we saw in the display last week that he is willing to take an incredibly strong stance on behalf of executive power. And I think to John's point about how the political winds are shifting and growing towards the inevitability of impeachment, and you look at Donald Trump continuing to fight it, and he may not want it, but Republicans on the one hand really would like it because they kind of know that it helps them, and the Democratic base certainly does want it.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.